Hello, this is Safe and Safe Country podcast, and me, its author and host, Alina Frolova. As you know, we're speaking here about security of the country, of each of us, of personal security, about the current war, where we're going on, what would be in the world after the completion of this war, what should be Ukrainian victory look like, and many other things which are influencing your daily life. This podcast is produced jointly by Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainskaya Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on all the resources of Ukrainskaya Pravda, as well as at any largest podcast platform. So today we have a guest who is one of the biggest Ukrainian supporters in this war. This is Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges. Ben, welcome.
Thank you for the privilege.
You was the former commander general of U.S. Army in Europe, and when you're commenting now all the events which are happening around Ukraine, usually you are more focusing on Crimea and all the situation in the Black Sea, saying that this is the key actually to win this war. I absolutely agree with you about that, but most of the analytics still are focused on the land operations. It looks like a very, daily, understandable for them. There is a lot of movements there. There are a lot of tactical issues which can be discussed. And the length of all the front line is quite a substantial, more than 1,000 kilometers. But if we will have a look at 2024, with all the circumstances which the previous year brought to us, what do you expect? Where would be the focus of attention, sea or land?
Well, of course, I don't think it's going to be either or. Ukraine will continue to take steps to make Crimea untenable for Russian Navy, for Russian Air Force, to eliminate Crimea as a place from which drones can be launched, missiles can be launched. So I think this will constantly be under pressure from the Ukrainian side using whether it's missiles, drones, special forces, partisans. That's going to continue. I think on the land side, my sense is that Ukraine will continue to look for ways to destroy Russian logistics and Russian headquarters, because this is how you neutralize the only advantage the Russians have, which is their mass, the large numbers of people. If you take away headquarters and you take away logistics, then that mass is much less effective. But of course, Ukraine has to do some things internally as part of improving its land effort. I think they are working hard on being able to operate against Russian electronic warfare capabilities, which have always been substantial. I think that they will continue to look for ways to counter Russian drones. And then also, I think there's an effort underway to improve the manpower system. There are plenty of women and men in Ukraine to serve in the armed forces, but I think the recruiting system is something that needs attention. And of course, this is a political issue as well. It's not just a bureaucratic thing.
For the last period, we obviously see that Russia emphasized its efforts to do something on Donbass, to do some offensive. And this offensive, let's call it offensive, started more than 4 months ago. And they didn't get any substantial success there. But still, from what I see all around discussions of journalists and experts, I'm talking not about Ukrainian, but Western one, they speaking about some successful approach of Russians. At the same time, Ukraine has also a 4 or 5 months counteroffensive, which also didn't reach some substantial goals last summer and autumn, but it was claimed completely failed. Why is it so? Maybe you have an answer why the evaluations are so different.
Well, I was wrong. I overestimated what Ukraine's land forces might be able to accomplish, but that failure was not on the part of Ukraine. It was on the part of the United States and Germany, that we did not provide capabilities that I had thought we would provide, such as long range precision weapons, adequate mine clearing equipment. We still don't have the F 16s delivered yet. So I think the fact that the Ukrainian counteroffensive on the ground part did not accomplish everything that we had hoped for is more a reflection on our failure to support than it was on Ukraine. And of course, we took so long. The Russians were not stupid. They took advantage of all the months to put in all these landmines, and um, we would never send an American soldier to attack that kind of defense without having already achieved total air superiority. So for us to have pushed Ukraine to do something without that, that's our failure. Now, of course, what happened on the ground is only part of the counteroffensive. The counteroffensive also included what Ukrainian armed forces were doing against the Black Sea Fleet, for example. I think it's not a coincidence that there are constant attacks happening on Russian infrastructure throughout Russia. This is also part of the effort. On the other hand, you're right. Why don't people talk about Russia's failed counteroffensive? And I think it's probably because the Russians themselves call it a big offensive or a big mobilization or whatever they're doing, but it doesn't look like it. I mean, they're losing 1,000 people per day getting killed in these mindless meatwave attacks. And I think that Ukraine probably is going to continue to bleed Russian forces, and the Russians are not gaining anything. So I think we're going to be in this situation for a while. I don't think the Russians have the ability to knock out Ukraine. There is no big force out there waiting over the horizon to come in that's trained and modernized. It doesn't exist. So I think Russia's only hope is to continue what they're doing to convey the impression that they can do this forever because they see that the West, at least the United States and Germany, are not fully committed to helping Ukraine actually win.
Coming back to what you said about the Black Sea, if we look at the situation right now, just like today, so we have some kind, many experts also called it a stalemate, especially after the Zaluzhny's article in Economist. But now, let's say, opinions started to be shaken. So people are starting to pay attention to the Black Sea operations, which Ukraine is doing. And I'm absolutely agree with you that it's like extremely successful. But the latest days, the successes which we have in air, this is not like countering air superiority, but this is some kind of establishing balance in the air, not dominance, but balance yet. And I think it's also somehow very substantial for the next period. At the same time, based on everything what Putin said, he feels quite confident in his position for the next year. So we have some kind of cutting of their dominance on the sea, cutting of their dominance in air. At the same time, they have superiority in number of manpower. Plus, I believe that hopes for the political solution after the election in states. So for next year, having all this on the table and understanding that the stalemate is not the option for Ukraine, actually, if we want to win this war. How you see the developments? What do you see for the next year? What it could be?
So you highlight several important things. Yes, the Ukrainian side is having very good success on the Black Sea in a very unconventional way. I mean, I think Ukraine has changed the character of naval warfare, at least on something like the Black Sea in that region. And our ally Turkey continues to prevent Russia from bringing more ships into the Black Sea, which is a very important part of this. And then with Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria are going to work together to continue clearing mines out of the Western Black Sea. These are all positive developments. And of course, the commander of the Black Sea Fleet is having to relocate some of his ships further to the east towards Novorossiysk because they are so vulnerable in Sevastopol. This is a very, very positive development. And I think we should continue to provide Ukraine everything it needs to make it impossible for the Black Sea Fleet to stay in Crimea. In the air, again, Ukraine is proving to be the most technically innovative armed force I've ever seen. I mean, they not only use effectively what they have, also the tactics that they use. As we have learned in the last few days after the shoot down of this A50, I mean, this is a big deal because of that kind of capability being knocked down shows that the Russians have not been able to achieve air superiority. Now, the Russian Air Force has not been able to destroy one single train or convoy that brings in equipment and ammunition from Poland. This is incredible to me that the Russian Air Force, with all the advantages, has failed the top two priority tasks: air superiority and interdiction of the opponent's line of communication. So it will be a long time before Ukraine is able to achieve air superiority, but at least if they can prevent Russian air forces from being able to do anything against Ukrainian ground forces, for example, as well as preventing them from launching missiles against civilian targets inside Ukrainian cities. I'm not so sure that President Putin is confident. He certainly wants to and needs to present an air of confidence. He has a fake election coming up here on 17 March. But I get the feeling that there is some urgency or some concern. I mean, there's no mobilization announced before this. We see riots in parts of the Russian Federation. The infrastructure is falling apart in so many different places. And I think that the losses that they are sustaining are not something that they can keep doing forever. So if we in the West could commit to Ukraine winning, and also if we could tighten up the various sanctions that are out there, isolate Russia from getting anything from Iran or North Korea or China, this thing would be over. So I don't understand why anybody has a narrative that somehow Russia's winning or that it's inevitable that they're going to win. I would say it's exactly the opposite.
But at the same time, probably the last months is first in the latest history, we heard claims of few European politicians who said that we should be prepared to war. It was said by the German Minister of Defense, Sweden Minister of Defense. So they're seriously saying about the Europe need to be prepared to direct combat with Russia. And the latest they posted this scenario of training for German forces with actual operation and facing the Russian troops. How realistic is that Russia has or will allocate some resources for direct operation against Europe in the next year?
Well, it certainly seems unlikely, and we want to keep it unlikely. We know from history that the best way to prevent a war is to make it very clear that you are prepared for war. This is called deterrence. And I think Germany and Poland and Lithuania, other countries in Eastern Europe that have been under Russian influence, they can see that if Ukraine is not successful, and especially if the US is to turn its back on Europe, or with the Trump administration, for example, that then Russia will be tempted to keep going. I mean, they say it. You saw the statement yesterday from Mr. Medvedev. I mean, they don't even hide what the ambition is. Putin, Medvedev, and all the other idiots that they have on their TV shows, what they talk about. So I think it's exactly the right thing for Germany and France and other countries to get serious. UK about being prepared for the possibility of a conflict with Russia. So many people said, come on, Russia's never going to attack Ukraine. Well, of course they did. And so I think that we've got to demonstrate the alliance cohesion, that we have the ammunition, we have all these things to make sure that Russia does not make another terrible miscalculation.
Okay. So everyone is asking and just considering what would be if United States will postpone with the approval of the decision on further support of Ukraine. From one point of view, we see that Europe is like declaring increasing assistance. They make an audit of what was provided by each and every country, and Germany now took a lead and tried to push other European countries to be more precise in supplies. Do you believe that the United States can just go on this path further without approving the assistance? Do you see the opportunity for cutting up completely the assistance to Ukraine?
Well, I have to say that I am astounded and saddened that the Republican Party, the party of Reagan that was always so strong against Russia, has now completely abandoned that legacy, that they have given in to Trump and a handful of people that don't understand how European security and prosperity is essential to American security and prosperity, and that Ukraine winning, defeating Russia, is in our best interest. So we've got domestic politics has taken over, unfortunately, in this, and that's what's holding up the aid from the United States to Ukraine. Now, of course, the president has a responsibility also. They can't just talk about, we're with you for as long as it takes. The president and his team have got to explain to American voters why this is to our advantage that Ukraine is successful. That this is not some charity case, but this is our advantage. This helps us if Ukraine is successful, and it hurts us if Ukraine is not successful. So the president has got to do a better job of this, and then we can get this done. But I'm not naive. We are in an election year. And so, of course, these kinds of factors are going to have an impact. I think our European friends and Canadian friends see the potential of a U.S. failure, but that doesn't mean that the threat from Russia goes away. In fact, it gets worse. And so, European countries and Canada are finally getting more serious about helping Ukraine, more serious about their own defense, because they will have to. If the U.S. fails, they will have to do it.
Yeah, but we see the quite different dimensions of everything what's going on. From one point of view, for example, US is signing the agreement with Finland, like giving some kind of guarantee and security guarantees. From another point of view, we see this moving towards isolation from the point of view of the United States, and especially Trump is declaring it. Last time when Trump came to power, everyone was surprised because actually he gave the weapon to Ukraine. And do you see some kind of possibility for maneuver for Ukraine here if Trump will be the next president? Do you see some kind of window of opportunity that we can ensure him that he's on the helping Ukraine, he can be on the part of winner, not loser in this war?
I hope so. I mean, if he becomes the president, obviously, whoever our president is, America's strategic interests remain the same. My biggest concern about Trump from an external standpoint is what damage he might do to NATO or the perception that the U.S. is committed to NATO. That would be the real damage. He may see opportunity, or he may realize, or people around him may realize, that there's a big difference between campaigning and actually being in government. And of course, everybody that understands the importance of Ukraine will continue to push for that. It's interesting that most members of Congress, including Republicans, actually support Ukraine. So it's not like there's no support. It's locked up in a small number that are using immigration. They see immigration problems in America as the number one issue for this presidential election. And so they're going to do everything they can, keep this as the issue, even if it hurts us and other things that we need to be doing.
Okay, let's come back to your military experience. Yes, so we see now the multiple conflicts which are rising up. The Israeli war already influenced the Red Sea, and we saw the reaction of United States and United Kingdom on this. We can observe escalation between North and South Korea. Everyone is a little bit nervous about China and Taiwan. So looking at all these scenarios, whether Western world has enough capabilities to deal with it, or at some point they will have to reorient themselves and neglect some of these hotspots.
Okay, so you've done a good job there of laying out what these different problems are. And I think it is time for us to get organized and look at all of these conflicts or potential conflicts as parts of a strategic whole, that they are connected. Iran is Russia's most reliable ally. Iran provides drones and they do other things to help Russia. Russia, in return, I'm sure, is providing nuclear technology to Iran. So those two are working together. The Kremlin was the biggest beneficiary from the Hamas attack on Israel. So, because it distracted world attention and diverted resources that Ukraine needs, it's all going to Israel. And so I don't think this was a coincidence. I think there's not a piece of paper that says, Dear Ayatollah, please attack,
Yeah.
but there's this cooperation. We know this. And then you've got the other Iranian proxies are doing things such as the Houthis attacking ships out in the Red Sea. I mean, These are all parts of a disruption of the situation in the Middle East. Now you've got Iran launching missiles against Pakistan as well as Iraq, and you've got Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon. This is a scenario that creates, if you can't step back from it, you're like, oh my God, these problems, this might expand, this might expand. And then you've got North Korea, which, of course, you saw that President Kim Jong Un recently is changing the law, saying that South Korea, is an enemy, and they practice launching big missiles over Japan. Very reckless, irresponsible behavior, while providing low quality ammunition to Russia. And the Chinese are watching all this. The Chinese are watching to see, can the West, the US, UK, Germany, France, all of the allies, as well as our allies in the Pacific region, do we have the combined political will, defense industry capacity, and military capability to help Ukraine defeat Russia, help Israel destroy Hamas, deter Iran from expanding the conflict, and still be able to deter China from making a terrible miscalculation? Of course, we've got the potential for all of this. The combined economies of our countries dwarfs the other side. But do we have the political will to do all that? That is not clear yet.
Political will is important, but the production facilities are also important. How you evaluate the capability of these Western countries in production, whether they're ready to all this multiple conflict support?
Well, if there is no political will, there is no growth of defense industry. I mean, the defense industry is not like the car industry or the kitchen appliance industry or the clothing industry. In all these other industries, people make something and they hope that you will buy it. In defense industry, you can only make things in response to an order and money from the government. So the government's political will is expressed in the form of, here's $1 billion for 500,000 rounds of artillery ammunition, for example. So if we want to grow our defense industrial capacity, then governments like in the US and UK and Germany have to allocate the money for them to do it. And of course, these industries, they're not charities. They have thousands of employees. They have very complex supply chains. And so we can say we want more, but if the governments don't have the political will to actually put the money into it, then, name the different companies can't produce it and hope that somebody buys it.
And from another point of view, we have now the tactics of Russia, which changed very much from the last winter, because last winter they targeted mainly infrastructure, like a civilian infrastructure, electricity, and all the other. But now what they do, they specifically target in the industry and defense industry in Ukraine. And yes, we're suffering. Yes, we are not disclosing all the results of these attacks, but there are some atrocities which are substantial. In this situation, when we don't have, let's say, some kind of guarantee from Western countries that they are ready to produce, and Ukraine has difficulties in establishing these enterprises on our ground, what could be an option?
I live here in Frankfurt, Germany, and we know in the Second World War, after 2 years of continuous bombing by the Americans and the British against German industry, German aircraft production actually increased in 1944. So, despite continuous bombing, industry here in Germany was able to increase production. So, it's not easy, obviously, but it is also not impossible that Ukraine will be able to increase production of what it needs as the government and Ukrainian industry and also Western companies that are coming into Ukraine to help build capacity as they become more efficient at doing things, avoiding detection or destruction. So it obviously requires a different way of doing things. You can't just have a big giant factory that produces tanks and expect it not to be hit by the Russians. Of course it will. But I imagine that the Ukrainians are getting very good, that Ukrainian industry and government and armed forces are getting very good at improving their efficiency of how to make what needs to be made and to be able to avoid the destruction from Russian missiles. Now, I'm going to say this as an outsider who doesn't have complete insight on what's going on inside Ukraine, but I'm not 100% convinced that Ukraine has fully converted to wartime footing. I mean, this is a very difficult political decision in a democratic country. But, we talked about the manpower situation earlier. Has industry made the conversion to focus on what's needed to win the war? Is that the principal focus of Ukrainian industry, as well as doing other things that are essential, like obviously, production of food and energy and so on? I don't know. That's just something that the government, I'm sure, is taking a look at.
Okay, let's speak a little bit about lessons learned, and not for only for Ukraine, but for Western countries. Yeah, I
Mm.
see quite a substantial changes in wording, at least of military, like a high level of military officials of Western countries, speaking about Ukraine, speaking about their readiness, speaking about decision-making process in NATO, for example. But I don't see yet the changes on the ground. So there is like some kind of idea that we need to change the approach, but looking at operational level, I don't see it yet. You know the NATO countries, the NATO militaries, you still speaking to many of them, you have a reputation. What's going on inside? Do you see some kind of changes in armies, changes in approach? And NATO, of course. NATO is still the only alliance which can guarantee this collective defense. And is there any changes there in perception of reality? And is there any changes in readiness? And again, the readiness for Ukraine to be a part of the NATO?
NATO would be better the minute that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. I mean, we'll immediately be better because of the capabilities of Ukrainian armed forces, the experience. I mean, the veterans of Ukrainian armed forces, air, land, sea. I mean, we get better immediately. So I hope that this happens quickly. It's not going to happen quickly, but I wish it would happen quickly that Ukraine were invited to join the alliance. But what we do know is that, as Clausewitz tells us about the nature of war, that's unchanging. Violence, fear, uncertainty, friction. This is what war is. That's the nature of war. What does change, however, is the character of war. What does it look like? And so, what we're seeing is a change in the character of war, particularly because of the use of drones, obviously. I mean, we've had drones for years, but never in this sort of quantity and also variety and quality. That's changing things. And I know General Zaluzhny alluded to that in his Economist article, that we've got to figure out a way to counter that. And eventually we will, where that gets equalized. This is the way it always is in warfare. When a new technology is introduced, it takes a while to. The long range precision weapon is now really so much more prevalent and necessary than before. Because you can see everything, you need to be able to target it, which means you have, the Russians quickly learned they had to move headquarters and logistics further away after HIMARS first arrived. And so, and the way that you can neutralize Russia's advantage in numbers is to destroy headquarters and artillery. So that means, and logistics. So getting long range precision weapons. So certainly in the US military and other militaries, we're seeing a significant increase in the use of long range precision weapons. One of the things that we have been reminded, I don't want to say we learned it because we already knew it, but we've been reminded, is the incredible amount of ammunition that is required. I mean, in 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, we did not shoot as much artillery as what's happening now in less than a month between Ukraine and Russia. So, we've already talked about our production facilities and the need to get that going again. So this is an important thing that we've been reminded that has to be done. The other thing that we've been reminded about is, even with all of this technology, you still have to have quality, well trained, committed women and men in the armed forces to do what needs to be done. When I look at video, like you and everybody else, we look at video of, you see Russian tanks getting destroyed, and people say, oh, this is the end of tanks. No, it's the end of stupid tanks. It's the end of any tank that sits out in the open that's not properly protected or concealed, and they don't have good sergeants that make their soldiers do the right thing, it is the end of them for sure. So continuing to invest in the training of women and men to be good sergeants, good officers, so that their soldiers do the right things to be successful and to survive. We have been reminded how important this is.
Yes, I think that openness you just like mentioned about the video and all the footage from the front line is like some kind of incredible, and it changed the character of war very much. I just today in the morning I saw video of FPV Ukrainian drone fighting with FPV Russian drone. So that was like a completely, some kind of games which we saw before, like a computer games. And how does it influence the new developments in weapons? You cannot make any decision without being seen by your adversary. You can't make any movement without being seen by your adversary. I think that, yes, tanks, yes, artillery, yes, and long range missiles, obviously, yes. But there should be some kind of principle change in this situation from the military point of view.
Well, I think everybody's industry and military are watching this conflict in Ukraine, trying to figure out, wow, what works, what doesn't work, how do we accelerate development, how do you I listened to a presentation yesterday about electric aircraft,
Mhm.
getting adequate battery power to provide enough power that an airplane could carry a large payload with people or ammunition, for example. These kind of developments are underway. But something that is true today was true back when I was a lieutenant in the early 1980s, a long time ago. And I was, in the U.S. military here in West Germany, and the Soviet Union was our Cold War opponent. And of course, the Soviet side had much more artillery and tanks and troops. It was much bigger than NATO forces. And so we knew on the modern battlefield, the mantra was what can be seen can be hit, and what can be hit can be killed. I mean, it's a kind of a simple statement of the obvious, but when you think about it like that, if you can be seen, you're going to be hit. And if you can be hit, you're going to be killed. So that drove our training to make sure that tanks and vehicles and everybody understood how to be concealed, to stay below the ground, and then to be able to come up, hit the other side, and then go back into. That requires a lot of training. It also drove the development of things like our Abrams tank or the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Apache helicopter. The technology that they had enabled them to avoid being seen, and also so that they could survive that hit. So this is kind of simplistic, but it's still true today. And I think tank doesn't have to weigh 75 tons. So I think you're going to see developments that provide protection, but with different materials. Maybe you have robotics, nobody up in the turret, things that can reduce the weight for modern warfare. I think we're going to see a lot more robotics with no people inside.
Yeah, it's interesting. And by the way, the Bradleys got the very good results and very good feedbacks from Ukrainian armed forces being now in operations on Donbas area. Okay, if we speak about the tactical result, and for us, the coming to restoring our borders is somehow a tactical result, because everyone understands, as you mentioned, Medvedev, who said that Ukraine in any capacity is a threat to Russia. And yes, we will repeat and repeat again our attacks on Ukraine, whatever happens. So the first goal is to restore our territory and borders. But Russia won't stop over it. So what you do recommend to make now to be more efficient in this first stage, and what we should do in longer term to be efficient in defeating Russia for the next period of 50 years?
Well, of course, I say this as an outsider, but when I look at the map, nothing is more important than the liberation of Crimea. Ukraine will not be able to rebuild its economy. It will always be under threat from Russian forces as long as Russia occupies Crimea. Russia is not entitled to keep Crimea. I hear occasionally from people, come on, Crimea was always Russia. No, it wasn't. Crimea is so important for Russia, they'll never give it up. They're not entitled to keep it. I mean, if we're serious about what we say is important, international law, respect for sovereignty, all the things embodied in the UN Charter, then we have to fight for those things because the Chinese are watching. Are we really serious about freedom of navigation and respect for sovereignty? I think that we should not be scared of Russia being defeated and the regime collapsing. Who knows what will happen after Ukraine liberates Crimea? It could be the end of Putin. It's not our job to keep him in his job. This is up to the Russian people. Of course, they won't go easy, but I don't know how anybody that understands geography and history and a little bit of economics could possibly push Ukraine to accept a negotiated settlement where Russia keeps Crimea. To me, that's not a tenable solution. Russia has never, ever in its history lived up to any agreement it makes. And we know that Russia only respects strength. So I think the goal should be isolate Crimea, make it impossible for Russian forces to stay there. And then eventually, Ukrainian forces will be able to get into the peninsula and liberate it completely. Of course, that big bridge, Kerch Bridge, is going to go away. I think it's gone this year. I don't know how the Ukrainians will do it. It'll be very difficult. But if there's anybody in the world that can do it, it will be Ukraine. I think that this long line of contact that runs from up close to Kharkiv all the way down to Kherson, you don't have to push back on the whole thing. That's a very linear World War One sort of mentality. The other parts, that'll come later. The key, I think whoever has Crimea wins this war. And so the sooner that gets done, and I know the Ukrainian general staff knows this, they don't need me to offer advice, but that's how I look at it.
And what about the next period? How to deter Russia after we win this war?
Once Russia has been defeated, I think there's going to be a lot of things happening inside Russia. I don't know who comes next. He cannot be any worse, or she cannot be any worse than Vladimir Putin. Whoever comes next will inherit a shattered military, a terrible defense industry. They have no friends except Iran. And so I think that the next leader of Russia will be focused on trying to rebuild what they have, focus inward and trying to keep things together rather than going externally. I think Belarus is an interesting part of this strategic situation to follow. At some point, people have got to be wondering why are things so good in Ukraine? Why did it get so much better in Poland? Why is it so much better in Baltic countries than when it was part of the Soviet Union? So I think Ukraine, of course, will always live next door to Russia. There will always be the potential for a threat. But, Estonia deals with that, Finland deals with that. And the way they deal with it is by having a good, strong military, reserve forces that are able to mobilize quickly. Ukraine will need to do that. But also, Ukrainian society will have to be resilient to reduce the vulnerability. That means continuing to work for transparency. Ukraine has very active journalists. I think this is an important part of a democracy that so many journalists are out there asking hard questions, looking into corruption or abuse of resources. These are the kind of things that have to be done. So a resilient society is just as important as having really good tanks and artillery.
And I think that Ukraine proved it already in 2022. Thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you so much for your support of Ukraine.
Elena, thank you. I am inspired by the people of Ukraine, what I see, not just of armed forces, but also of civilian people like you that are also making such a contribution.
We do our best. We have no choice, actually. The situation very simple. So just would like to remind all our listeners that it was the podcast Safe Unsafe Country. And I'm its host, Alina Frolova. And we had Ben Hodges today as a guest. And you can find our podcast on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and others. This podcast is a joint project of Center for Defense Strategies Ukrainskaya Pravda and Media Center Ukraine. And only on us depends when the unsafe word will disappear. Thank you.